welcome back for another deep dive.
Yes.
Last time we were talking about the grading system for hadiths.
Yes.
We learned it's not,
Not as straightforward as people think.
kind of a mixed bag there.
Yes.
Well, today, we're going to go even deeper into the world of hadiths.
Okay.
We're going to be exploring their history
All right.
and why it matters if you're interested in Islam as a whole.
It's interesting, thinking about hadith.
Yeah.
It's kind of like exploring this massive ancient library.
Okay.
There are so many volumes, so many stories and teachings that it can feel very overwhelming.
Right.
But understanding where these texts come from, their historical context, is like finding the library's map.
Okay.
It helps us navigate this vast collection and understand how it all fits together.
I love that analogy.
Thank you.
So let's start with something even more basic. Why should anyone even care about hadiths in the first place?
Yeah, well, for Muslims, the importance is very clear-cut.
Okay.
The Quran itself emphasizes the obligation to obey both the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
Hadiths are meant to provide those sayings and actions of the Prophet, so they're not just optional reading.
I see.
They're a fundamental part of Islamic belief and practice.
So there's a direct religious obligation for Muslims to follow the hadiths.
Yes.
That makes sense. But what about for someone who isn't Muslim?
Okay.
Someone who's maybe just interested in history or religion in general?
Right.
Why should they care?
Even from a non-religious perspective,
Yeah.
hadiths offer this fascinating window into the life and teachings of Muhammad.
Okay.
And he is considered the ultimate role model in Islam.
Right.
So understanding his life as told through hadiths is essential to understanding Islam itself.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But there's this common misconception that hadiths were only written down centuries after Muhammad's death, relying on, potentially unreliable oral transmission.
It's fascinating how many misconceptions there are around hadiths. People just assume they were passed down through, like whispers, like oral traditions for centuries. And that, that makes them unreliable, but the reality is much more nuanced.
So let's debunk this whole unreliable oral tradition myth.
Right.
I'm ready for some myth busting.
All right, let's bust some myths. So the common story you hear is that hadiths were only written down in the 9th century after being passed down orally for 200 years. But that's not the whole story. The collection of hadiths started much earlier, during Muhammad's lifetime. His followers, they recognized his significance right from the beginning. So they started documenting his words and actions.
Well, yeah, it's like if you're being told to follow someone's teachings, you're going to want to keep a record of what they said.
Exactly.
Makes sense to me.
And these records weren't just, whispers in the wind. They were written down.
Oh, wow.
Companions of the Prophet kept personal notebooks. They were called suhuf,
Okay.
specifically to record hadiths. And there's, for example, Abdullah ibn Alas. He was a prominent companion. He had a collection called Al-Sahifa al-Sadiqa, which means the truthful scroll.
Wow. So oral transmission might have played a role, but the written documentation was there, like, from the start.
Precisely.
Okay. So if people were already writing things down, why is the 9th century so significant for hadiths?
Well, the 9th century is when those major hadith collections that we know today were compiled. It's often framed as this sudden shift, but it was actually a response to a growing problem.
Oh, wait?
As Islam spread, the number of fabricated hadiths, it increased, leading to all these inconsistencies and confusion.
So it was like a crisis of authenticity.
Exactly.
Like too much information floating around, and not all of it was accurate.
Exactly. Think of it as this massive effort to sift through all the noise and try to establish a reliable source for Muslims.
It also is like a government-led project to try to standardize things.
Yeah, you could say that. It was a concerted effort to try to curb the spread of these fabricated hadiths and to create a more authoritative collection. And it's interesting because some people today, they'll try to dismiss hadiths entirely just because they're uncomfortable with certain content. But that actually contradicts the original purpose of these 9th century compilations.
Right. You can't just ignore the historical context and the original intentions behind these collections.
Precisely. Understanding the context is crucial for any meaningful discussion about hadiths.
Now, about those collections, we know there are those debates about hadith authenticity. Did that factor into what made it into those official books?
What's interesting is that this modern obsession with hadith authenticity, it might be later development, the various grading systems used in the 9th century suggest that the focus wasn't just on eliminating, like, the weak hadiths.
Okay.
It was more about compiling a comprehensive representation of the knowledge about the prophet.
So it's more about like preservation than being overly selective.
Yeah.
That brings us back to your giant library metaphor.
Yes.
But just how many hadiths are we talking about here? Like, how many are there?
It's a vast body of literature. Today we know of about 130,000 hadiths, with 83,000 of those belonging to the Sunni tradition. And get this, just the 6 major canonical books, the ones that Muslims consider essential to study, they contain 38,000 hadiths.
38,000. That's mind-boggling.
It's a massive amount of information. To put it in perspective, that's the equivalent of 13 Qurans.
Wow. That really puts things into perspective. I always thought reading the Bible was a commitment. To put that in perspective for our bookworm listeners, that's like reading the entire Harry Potter series.
It's like trying to read 1.4 Bibles.
No wonder there's so much debate and interpretation surrounding hadiths.
Yeah.
That's a lot to digest.
It really is. And it's not just the sheer number, the content itself, the stories, the details. They're incredibly rich and complex. It's like trying to make sense of 5,000 movie synopses all at once.
5,000 movie synopses. Yeah, I'd be lost in that information overload for sure. Okay, so we've established that hadiths are a big deal.
Yeah.
They're religiously mandated.
Huh?
They were intentionally curated to combat misinformation. And there's a mountain of them.
Yes.
But what does this all mean for our understanding of Islam?
That's a great question.
If it's practically impossible for anyone to truly master this massive amount of text, how can we say anything definitive about what it teaches?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And one that scholars continue to grapple with.
Right.
The reality is even the most seasoned Islamic scholars don't have a perfect grasp of this vast body of literature.
I see. You know, it's kind of funny to think about. You see those images of Islamic scholars with shelves upon shelves of books behind them?
Right.
But maybe they haven't actually memorized every single word in those books.
It's just too much for any one person to absorb and truly master. And you know what's really fascinating is that while these hadiths were compiled under the authority of a Muslim government in the 9th century, they don't always reflect how Islam is presented or understood today.
Oh, that's interesting. So are you saying that by going back to these original sources, we might find a version of Islam that's different from what we often hear from, say, modern religious leaders or institutions?
Precisely. It's kind of like comparing a historical document to a modern political campaign.
Okay.
There can be a lot of spin and interpretation layered on top of the original message,
Right.
shaping how it's understood and applied.
So in a way, these hadiths are like a time capsule,
Yes.
giving us a glimpse into the early days of Islam.
Yes.
Without all the filters and interpretations that have developed over the centuries.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so valuable, even from a purely historical perspective.
Yeah.
They offer a window into the social, political, and cultural norms of early Islamic society.
I'm starting to see why you said it's both a curse and a blessing. It's challenging to grapple with such a massive and complex body of work.
Right.
But it also means that there's so much to discover, so many layers to unpack.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it underscores the importance of approaching these texts with a critical eye.
Right.
Remember, it's not about finding a single correct interpretation,
Right.
but about engaging in a dialogue with the past.
Okay.
Understanding the forces that shaped these texts and their impact on the world.
Okay. I'm convinced.
Yeah.
We need to explore these hadiths ourselves and see what we can find.
Yes.
But before we go off on our own treasure hunt,
Let's recap what we've learned. The Quran itself emphasizes the obligation to obey both the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad.
right.
Hadiths are meant to provide those sayings and actions of the Prophet, so they're not just optional reading.
I see.
They're a fundamental part of Islamic belief and practice.
We busted that myth about, hadiths just being passed down through like oral traditions for centuries.
Right.
The reality is that collection process began much, much earlier with a strong emphasis on written documentation from the start.
Right. But even with those early efforts to preserve the Prophet's words and actions, the sheer volume of hadiths that were collected over time,
Right.
it presents this this unique challenge. It makes studying them this monumental task,
Right.
and it also opens the door to selective interpretation.
Which brings us back to that idea
Yeah.
of a less sanitized version of Islam, potentially hidden within those thousands of hadiths.
Exactly. So, dear listener, we leave you with this question: if hadiths are meant to guide Muslims on how to live, what happens when those texts contain content that clashes with modern values or understandings?
It's a question that, invites further exploration. So to our listeners out there, don't be intimidated by the sheer number of hadiths or the complexities we've discussed. Dive in, explore, challenge assumptions. You might just discover a side of Islam that you never knew existed.
Until next time, may your curiosity guide you.